Ink Ribbon.
So in the early 2000s, gaming was in a golden age. We had the PlayStation 2, Xbox had just become a new console, and there was the GameCube. And we had the Dreamcast. RIP. But on top of this, we also had two of the most amazing handhelds ever, the PSP and the Game Boy Advance. One reason that this time was so nice for gaming is that companies weren't at each other's throats like they are today. No, back then they were all just working on good games, and that was it. Also back then, there weren't third-party companies signing exclusivity deals like we have today. I mean, they did, but it was nowhere near the same level as the current gaming environment. In fact, most third-party games came out on all systems simultaneously, which was really awesome. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today, but there's a little bit of a unique twist to this, and that's the era of Game Boy Advance ports. And that's really what I'm going to talk about. So I have Googled this to death and seem to be the only one who's really interested by this, so I thought I'd share it with you, my viewers. The reason Game Boy Advance ports are so interesting to me is because for the most part, they're entirely different games than the console versions, mainly due to limitations of the GBA. I'm talking completely different games, usually with different graphics, different sounds, and music, and occasionally completely different gameplay. Let's use SSX Tricky as an example. So here's SSX Tricky on consoles. Now let's take a look at the GBA version. So we can see there's a very clear difference. While it is impressive they were able to get pseudo 3D graphics on the GBA, the sprite models of the characters just kinda make the game look muddy and weird. This is one of the examples that is in the middle. Some games translated really well, and some games were just utterly awful. One example of a bad version would be Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. While the graphics weren't as awful as they seem here, the gameplay was absolutely terrible. Aside from the irritating voices, the gameplay was really unresponsive and the AI just read your moves, making it almost impossible to beat. Trust me, it looks okay, but when you play it, it's awful. One of the best examples of a good GBA port is probably Tony Hawk 3. The console version was awesome, and the GBA port was different, but it was still pretty good. I mean, looking at them side by side, I'd say they both look pretty fun. Another awesome GBA port that I think is noteworthy of being mentioned is Max Payne. On the PS2, it was a third-person action game and for the time, revolutionary in a few ways, such as physics for environmental objects. But the GBA port is so cool. It looks like a really cool PC game from the early 90s. And Max's model is actually in 3D, which again is a very impressive feat for the GBA's limited processing power. So you've seen the good and the bad, but now let's talk about the weird. Well, maybe weird isn't the right word. Maybe different is a better word. Some examples that come to mind are Tomb Raider Legend, Midnight Club, and The Sims Bustin' Out. Let's look at Tomb Raider first. Tomb Raider Legend for consoles was in full 3D with Lara navigating large 3D environments, engaging in epic combat with enemies, and had fully voiced cutscenes. The GBA version, however, had none of these things. But it wasn't necessarily bad, it was just different. The GBA port of Legend was completely in 2D and played kind of like a Super Nintendo game, which was sort of cool in a weird way, kind of like seeing what Tomb Raider would look like if it came out in 1991 or something. But the gameplay was actually pretty solid for the GBA. Is it the same experience? Well, no, but it's still good. The same can be said for The Sims and Midnight Club. The Sims Bustin' Out for consoles was an awesome game and one of the closest things console gamers could get to playing the PC version. The GBA port was not. I would almost compare the GBA port of Bustin' Out to a game like Harvest Moon. The graphics, gameplay, music, and even themes were all completely different, which when I first tried it was very weird and almost off-putting. Same thing with Midnight Club. The console version was one of the first PS2 games I ever owned and looked amazing back in the day. It was a fully 3D racing game that was kind of like Diet Grand Theft Auto. You could sort of run over people, and you navigated a fully 3D city. What's interesting about the GBA port of Midnight Club is that instead it's a top-down game with almost a cartoony style and plays almost exactly like You guessed it, Grand Theft Auto. But this time, like the original games. I'd really love to cover more of these, but honestly it was surprisingly difficult to look up a lot of this information. If you guys like this, let me know, and if you know where I can find out more about these games, let me know in the comments. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Feel free to hit that subscribe button. I'm Kai Morgan, and as always, thanks for watching Ink Ribbon.